Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're looking into a story largely taking place far away from our typical destinations, like Ukraine, Russia, the Caucasus, or Central Asia. That's because today, we're talking about Chad, a landlocked country in Africa that's recently decided it might be time to dump its colonial ex and swipe right on a shiny, shirtless new partner riding a bear. Yeah, we were talking about Russia. Chad, the country that, in its post-colonial existence, was tied at the hip to France, is now cozying up to Moscow. Chad and France go way back, like an awkward prom couple who couldn't break up because of social pressure. So, without further ado, let's take a look at how these long-standing friendships can sometimes change seemingly overnight.
Chad has just become the newest element of what some see as the 21st century scramble for Africa, although this one, it seems, is more about African nations stepping away from colonial history. The country's leadership has broken off its military pact with former colonial power France.
The French military presence in Chad is not based on a reciprocal foundation. Chad must no longer accept from others what is not accepted for itself by those same others.
Chad is not the first former French colony to have done so. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have cast out the French army in the wake of military coups. Senegal is likely to join this group too, as relations have collapsed over France's responsibility for the 1944 French massacre of Senegalese soldiers. Senegal's president says that France should close its military bases in the country. Yet some observe these events with nervous expressions, as there is someone who is stepping in for France. Russia has been heavily investing in Africa. Vladimir Putin has been holding many meetings with various African leaders, and his diplomats have been touring the continent. France and Russia are now at dire odds. Relations between them have deteriorated in the wake of the latter's invasion of Ukraine. Africa seems to be becoming a new set piece in this rivalry.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. So first of all, let me bring you up to speed on some of the lore behind these players. In the 1980s, France helped Chad fend off a Soviet-backed Libyan invasion. In 2006, 2008 and 2019, French troops came to the aid of Chad's then-president Idriss Déby, keeping him in power through a series of rebellions. Even when Déby was killed in 2021, France didn't ghost Chad. They provided satellite intelligence to help the Chadian military fight off yet another rebel offensive. In short, France was Chad's go-to guy, the dependable one with a steady job and a sensible car. But here is where things got spicy. Idriss Déby's son, Mahamat, took over power in 2021 after his father's death and became Chad's transitional leader. France was like, great, so when's the election? And Mahamat was like, about that, let's push it out 18 months, actually make it 3 years. You know what, let's just call it a presidential term. France wasn't thrilled, but Mahamat didn't seem to care. He was busy shopping for new friends, and that's when Russia caught his eye. In January this year, Mahamat visited Moscow and met with Putin. Now, when a country like Chad, with a history of French military support, starts flirting with Russia, you've got to wonder, is this a rebound relationship, or is Chad ready to go full Kremlin? This isn't just about Chad. Across Africa, former French colonies are taking down their Macron posters to replace them with Vladdy Daddy ones. Look at Burkina Faso. After a coup in 2022, its junta kicked out French troops and sent flowers to the Kremlin. Mali and Niger are doing the same thing. Even the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS, is losing members to this new Russo-African bromance. So what's going on here? Well, a few things actually. First, Russia is offering what France wants, a no-strings-attached partnership. You know, France has this annoying habit of pushing for democracy, accountability, and human rights. Russia, on the other hand, is like, you do you, boo, just let us set up a Wagner Group outpost in your backyard and we're gonna be just fine. Second, Putin is playing the long game. He knows that Africa is rich in minerals and he's eager to secure access to those resources. But the game is about more than just money. Russia is looking for political support too. African countries can vote with Russia in the UN General Assembly and potentially even the Security Council. Every yes vote from Africa lets Putin pretend he's not isolated on the world stage. A geopolitical equivalent of hiring background actors to make your birthday party look packed, if you will. This shift isn't happening in a vacuum. France's influence in Africa has been declining for years, but as Chad moves closer to Russia, it risks alienating its traditional allies. And let's not forget, France has been a consistent lifeline for Chad in terms of crisis. So what is the takeaway here then? Chad's pivot to Russia is part of a larger trend across Africa, where former colonies are re-evaluating their relationships with Western powers. But in choosing new partners, these countries need to tread carefully. Aligning with Russia might bring short-term benefits, but it could also lead to long-term instability. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Tara O'Connor, Managing Director at Africa Risk Consulting. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you very much.
So, judging by the recent events, it appears that France is the big loser in Africa and Russia so far is the big winner. Why is that so? And is it really as simple as they said, or are there more nuances there which should be taken into account?
You're absolutely right in suggesting there are far greater nuances to this. And I think really it's Africa's autonomy is the great winner. I think you've got the youngest, Senegal has got its youngest new leader in Bassirou Faye, who was elected last December. And he was elected on a ticket of true independence, of Senegal really asserting its own sovereignty and independence from France. And it's worth remembering that there are 14 countries in West Africa that use a currency that is linked to the euro. And it's called the CFA franc, the Communauté Française Africaine, which harks back to 1948 and really was kept in place for the benefit of French business in Africa to a large extent. It's been a very stabilizing factor, but for West Africans, it has been a delaying factor to real independence. And so this has built up a lot of resentment against France across Africa. There were other treaties passed. There were economic treaties, there were military treaties, and there were foreign policy treaties that bound France at independence to its former colonies and those former colonies to France. One of the things was obviously the military bases, which are now being closed all over West Africa.
So would you say that France perhaps might be guilty of being fairly heavy-handed in the management of all those relations, i.e. not taking into account the fact that if you're actually talking to your former colonies, which are independent countries, they are no longer depending on you politically, then you should be going for empowerment rather than, trying to maintain all those links, just beyond, perhaps not beyond reach, but, beyond the visibility of the average person on the street, and then people realizing, okay, so these links are still there, so how about we turn to somebody else? And of course it seems that it's not the best option to turn to Russia, but this is the emotional reaction that people have, right?
It's an emotional reaction. That's exactly what I would say. I would separate out what's happened in Senegal, because Senegal has been it won a democratic election, and it's following, this Faye's decision is really asserting sovereignty, but on the back of the will of the people. And yes, France itself has been very divided over the maintaining of very close links to its former colonies since 1960. And French political class has been divided about this. A lot of the older members of the diplomatic corps and the intelligence corps and so on have all preferred to maintain these strong links, and business, of course, have enjoyed many years of what they call notre précaré, you know, our backyard, which is a kind of a closed shop for French business in West Africa. And that is at the root of the resentment that has been felt. And that has really led to a fertile ground for Russia to be able to use its extensive propaganda networks on the continent and actually present itself as the alternative. But the real alternative, where Russia has really felt, engaged, is the coup countries. There are a number of countries that, since 2012, basically, have Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, that have all had, military coups, and the military is in charge. They've upended the democratic constitutions of those countries, and they have basically shifted their allegiance wholesale to Russia. And in my opinion, this has been a disaster for the three countries that have called themselves the Alliance of Sahelian States, the AES.
So overall, what you're saying is, first of all, that we should not really put an equation mark between Chad and Senegal on the one hand, and countries like Mali, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, and so on, because the situation politically is very different. Also, both Chad and Senegal said it's not about breaking all the ties with France. It is about basically returning to a state where we don't want to have military facilities of other countries, because we are sovereign nations. Now, moving on to the countries that you've mentioned, the one that have explicitly been turning towards Russia, there are also apparently voices of dissent there. Let me just take a glance at a brief quote here. Now, this is from Paul Crescent-Beninga from the GTSC work group from the Central African Republic. He's saying something very interesting. We have an impression that we're simply changing our masters here. We have abandoned France only to become dependent on Russia. Would you say that this really is the kind of realization that will come to the societies there sooner or later, perhaps later, unfortunately, given that Russia is quite adept at really, using all those emotional signals and exploiting the fact that countries like France are very unpopular in Africa nowadays?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They've absolutely exploited that France is very unpopular, and politicians and people in the street are very suspicious of France, because France is perceived to have been behind lots of coup d'etat in the West African region throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And really, these African countries, these West African countries, really had no sense that they were in charge of their own destiny. But really, that's what these African countries want. And that's what the young, very young population, who are very interconnected, very connected via mobile phone to other political groups in neighboring countries, they know what's going on. And they do not want to replace giving up sovereignty to France to giving up sovereignty to another, less reliable partner, as Russia has proved to be. If you look at what's happened in those three countries, the AES states, what has actually happened is that, in asking the Western countries, that's US, EU, and France, to remove, and the UN, in fact, for their troops to leave, that has just opened the door to Islamist, extremist insurgents to have walked in. And in Mali's case and in Burkina Faso's case, they are now in control of whole swathes of the country. And in another significant move, we've actually seen a long-standing regional separatist group run by the Tuaregs actually form a new front, a front for the liberation and democracy and alternatives in those three countries, the AES countries, with the express desire to actually remove the Russian influence and to gain autonomy. So what you're actually seeing is a further fracturing, increase in violence and lots of civilian deaths and the creation of refugees. Recently, we've seen a lot of refugees leaving Mali as the crossfire between Russian and Malian troops attacking Tuareg troops. Tuareg fighters or rebels have been forcing people to flee into Algeria. So it's becoming a really serious regional problem, and one where the numbers of Russian troops that have been sent and the mercenaries, the Wagner mercenaries, are insufficient in number to replace the some 30,000 troops that have left Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger.
So what about Russia? Do you think that Russia has a very similar mentality to the colonizers of old, i.e. that it has this delusion that what it is doing is somehow benevolent? Do you think that Vladimir Putin or perhaps one of his henchmen at some point might have looked at this old caricature, the Rhodes Colossus, towering above Africa and thinking, oh, this should be us, this should be Russia? Or do you believe that they are simply cynical, that they want to create this sort of, the group of countries which they want to use to extract, minerals, natural resources, and that there is nothing ideological about Russia's approach?
I think it's very much more so my enemy's enemy is my friend. And in this situation, France is very much Russia's enemy. And so creating problems, and as is Europe, so creating problems in the Sahelian states on opening up another front to cause problems for Europe is very much on Russia's agenda. The very big difference between France, Europe and the US is that there was a significant development agenda behind their involvement. Yes, there's primarily security, business, I would suggest, but also a development agenda. There is no such agenda backing Russia's involvement. It's purely to extend its countries of influence in Africa, but there is no benefit to ordinary people for that. It's really about protecting the military rulers in the countries that they have taken under their wing. So it's about protecting the person in power first. Secondly, causing problems for my enemy's enemy is my friend. And thirdly, yes, you're absolutely right to suggest it's also an extractive operation. Mali, Burkina Faso have substantial gold resources, and that is enabling Russia to divert and to build up gold reserves to protect Russia against sanctions, against Western sanctions.
So it is a bit ironic that this is just a Russian cash grab. It doesn't even have this sort of intellectual veneer of respectability that existed in the 19th century for the colonizers back then. And still, people are falling for it in the information age. Perhaps this is a topic for a separate conversation altogether. For the time being, Tara O'Connor was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. And we're kicking today's overview off with Ukraine. On the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, Kiev's foreign ministry has rejected the possibility of another similar solution. Only full NATO membership, they say, can guarantee the country's security.
The foreign ministers of NATO are gathering to discuss matters of utmost importance to the alliance. These are turbulent times, as shown by the increased frequency of these types of summits, and the allies have to keep themselves on the same page. Ukraine has also used the meeting to voice its views. Kiev looks back on the Budapest Memorandum with resentment. It was meant to prevent a situation like the one it has found itself in. Now, as its leaders have emphasized every step of the way, it is interested only in full NATO membership, for all its territory. Back in the early 1990s, Ukraine inherited a large stockpile of Soviet nuclear weapons in the wake of the USSR's collapse. In exchange for dismantling this arsenal, Kiev received security and sovereignty guarantees in 1994 signed by the US, the UK and Russia. Clearly, at least one side hasn't kept its end of the bargain.
And now some chilling information on the military side of things. Russia has been resorting to using the so-called double-tap strike tactics against various targets in Ukraine, as it has in Syria in the past. Now, this tactic is meant to cripple emergency response services, such as firefighters.
Whether the death toll in a Russian strike is zero often depends on how quickly these men and women arrive on the scene. The Russians, reports say, are doing everything they can to make sure first responders do not make it on time. By resorting to the double tap, a proven tactic in 21st century warfare, Russian troops are aiming to kill emergency response services. They attack once, wait for the services to arrive, and then strike again. Ukrainian NGO Truth Hounds has confirmed 36 instances of double tap strikes in Ukraine. Russia employed this tactic in Syria. The Syrian Justice and Accountability Center says that between 2013 and 2021, 58 double-tap strikes were recorded. The organization says they intensified after Russia joined the war in 2015.
Staying on the subject of Ukraine's military, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been returning to their units after being AWOL. A new law allows soldiers to resume military service without facing criminal charges.
Leaving your military unit without authorization is usually a very bad idea, especially in times of war. A new law enacted just a few days ago has made it a bit easier for war-fatigued soldiers to return, however. Those who left for the first time can now return voluntarily without fear of facing any sort of criminal charges. 3,000 military personnel have already returned to active duty, offering a slight boost to the needs of the Ukrainian army. But it is a far cry from what Ukraine needs to solve its manpower issues on the front. Ukraine has been struggling with the issue of unauthorized military absences for a while now. Many soldiers have been leaving not just because of war fatigue, as the war reaches its third year, but also because of a lack of clearly defined service terms for mobilized personnel.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.